How was the United States Marine Corps set up to fight when it landed on the beaches of Guadalcanal? We look at Marine Corps doctrine and readiness prior to Operation Watchtower.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the first in what is going to be a significant series of podcasts looking at the Guadalcanal campaign. I'm very excited to have my very good friend as a guest on the podcast, Dave Holland. Dave has served as a Marine, he has lived on Guadalcanal, and he has encyclopedic knowledge not only of the Army and Marine Corps battles that were fought in the Guadalcanal campaign, but also the doctrine, the leaders, the history. He has also studied the tactics and history of the Japanese who were on the island as well. I was very lucky to do a 1-week battlefield study tour on Guadalcanal with Dave. His encyclopedic knowledge was apparent to everyone as we walked the ground. I can't think of anyone better to tell the stories of the battles on Guadalcanal than Dave. I'm very keen to look at the Guadalcanal campaign for 3 reasons. Firstly, it is the first offensive land campaign conducted by the United States after their entry into the Second World War. Because it is their first campaign, there will be a lot of lessons for anyone looking to conduct contested amphibious operations in the littoral in the future. Secondly, this is a very jointly orchestrated and synchronized campaign. The airfield needed to be held. The troops holding the airfield needed to be resupplied by the sea. That maritime resupply needed to be protected by aircraft flying from the airfield. If any one of those components failed, the campaign would fail. The planning and execution of this campaign has a lot of lessons for us to learn. To highlight just how much of a joint operation this was, there were more sailors killed in the Guadalcanal campaign than there were Marines and soldiers. Lastly, the Guadalcanal campaign is intrinsically linked to the Kokoda campaign, which we've looked at in depth. And I think it's very interesting to look at how those two campaigns are connected at the strategic level. So let's get into the interview with Dave Holland. Welcome to the podcast, Dave. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, James, and thanks again for having me on. I'm really excited forward to doing this podcast with you. So, as you know, I really get excited about talking about anything about Guadalcanal. So, when you reached out, I was more than happy to do this. So, yes, for my accent, hope I don't throw too many of the listeners off. My accent is a mix or hybrid accent between Alabama mixed with Australian. One time I had someone tell me they didn't know if I was from Alabama or Adelaide. They couldn't work it out. So I apologize in advance. I'm not really apologizing, but I always say you have an accent. I don't have an accent, but I'll try to slow down so people can understand me. So I'm a transplanted American in Australia. I've been here 30 years. So I'm basically retired from Australian Federal Police. And my background now is basically researching Guadalcanal, writing about Guadalcanal, leading limited tours to Guadalcanal. I lived on Guadalcanal for 3 years when I was deployed over there. I spent quite a bit of time walking the battlefields, walking others through the battlefields, researching, studying the main battlefields and also the smaller skirmish sites that really isn't written about. My job, what I wanted to do, my intent was to actually verify what I've read and try to locate new information because, nothing beats walking the ground. And when you actually walk the ground and study the terrain, and the terrain doesn't change that much since 1942. So if you look in an area, you think, well, if I was moving a unit through here and if I was going to place a machine gun and defend in an area, what worked in 1942 would work in 2025. So if you have an eye for the terrain, well, military background, I did 8 years in the U.S. Marines as infantry. And that's how I became to Australia. Originally, I was in the embassy. But 8 years in the Marines as infantryman. So I've gained a bit of skills to recognize the ground. So I left there in 2020. I've been back a number of times. And during that time, I've done a lot of research and studying about the battle. and I've been on a number of podcasts, YouTube appearances. I've spoken to a number of people. So that's my interest in Guadalcanal. And I guess originally started being a Marine. Guadalcanal is a big Marine battle. You learn about it in boot camp. Then I'm a military history nut since I was 6 years old. You combine those two, and it's great. I told one time it's just like, say, an Australian soldier being assigned to Gallipoli, who's a military history nut. You saying you go and be on Gallipoli for 2 years. Just walk the battlefield. Did be in their element, to be in their prime. That's what I was. I was in kind of my dream job, so I loved it. So now I try to pass that information on to others. Also assist veterans, not many veterans now, but veterans' families, locating information about their relatives on Guadalcanal, because there's not much information out there for them. So I assist in that. I try to dispel some of the myths and debunk some of the myths and misinformation about the Guadalcanal campaign. Probably find out in this series there's quite a few. Yeah, but I'm looking forward to speaking to you and just talking about the canal.
Excellent. So do you want to talk us through the Solomon Islands from a terrain and weather point of view? For those who've never been there, what is it like?
Well, it's like that movie. What is it? Robin Williams with the Vietnam. What is it? What's that movie?
Good Morning Vietnam.
You know, he said, "How hot is it? Open a window." You know, it's damn hot. No, well, Solomon Islands. I mean, it's a large chain. It's like 900 miles long. So Guadalcanal is on probably the southeastern part of the chain. I was going to say Guadalcanal. Some people think it's the largest island, but Bougainville is part of the Solomon Islands. It's actually the largest. So it's very typical. If some of your listeners know about New Guinea, Papua, and some of the other Solomon Islands, it's very, very hot. It's not that far off the equator. It doesn't really have a rainy season. It just rains 365 all the time. Very hot, humidity. The terrain, I'll just drill down to Guadalcanal itself. So Guadalcanal is 90 miles long, 25 miles wide. Sorry, I can't convert that into kilometers. We can do that very quickly. But anyway, it's about the same for the U.S. listeners. It's about the same size as the U.S. state of Delaware. So it's not a small place. Some people think it's just a small jungle island, but that's not the case. It does have a lot of jungles, but it also has a typical of the terrain there. It has a mountain range that runs through the middle of it. And the highest peaks of over 8,000 feet. So it's very, very treacherous terrain. So the northern coast, they call it the weather coast, is really, it's called that for a reason. So that's where a lot of your waves bash in, your storms bash in, and it has limited landing spots, and it's fairly straight up from the ocean. But then, sorry, that's the southern part. So the northern part is more of a flat terrain. It has a lot of kunai grass fields. Pre-war, a lot of the kunai grass fields were coconut plantations by the Lever brothers, coconut plantations. So they're planted in acres and acres of coconut plantation. So it goes from flat plains to rolling hills. And the rolling hills are very steep and the kunai grass covered. They're coral hills. So there's not much topsoil on top. So they don't have many trees. If you ever see the movie The Thin Red Line, a lot of that was filmed in northern Queensland. So the hills there are a good depiction of it. It's like kunai grass, which is the oven-like kunai grass they call sometimes about head high, and they cover a lot of the grassy knolls. And then it starts to go up into the elevation, and then you get the top of some of the mountains, and they're jungle covered. The ravines are deep. You have fast-flowing rivers and streams. They generally run from south to north, which are good defensive terrains. We'll see. So that's mainly the terrain of Guadalcanal. In pre-war, a lot of the people lived on the coconut plantations, or like they do in Melanesian villages. They live on the coast, or they live near the river mouths. Not many live in the highlands because that was very impassable, and it's probably not very conducive to human living. So the majority of people live on the coast. And the reason those flat coasts are good for, as we know, strategic gold, building Pacific strategic gold is building the airfields nice and flat. So that was a key there. And all kind of nasty critters, as you can imagine.
Yes, yeah. So looking then, that's the objective, or it will be for the Marines. What experience in littoral operations did the US Navy and Marines have before Guadalcanal?
Okay, as you'd expect, I mean, the Marine Corps had been around since 1775, same with the Navy. So in their history, they've done quite a number of amphibious assaults, starting from you can probably say, in the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. They did a lot of littoral river ops and sea operations in the American Civil War, Spanish-American War. So they had a bit of experience in it. But they were, I guess you could classify them as administrative type landings. Arrive off the shore, jump in a bunch of large boats, just row to the shore, land, and move on. So they're really against no opposed defender. So during the First Wars, we know Gallipoli, that was obviously opposed landing. So that turned a lot of countries off opposed landings on amphibious assault beaches. So the Americans in the 1920s, especially the Marine Corps, started saying, well, we're looking for a place. I mean, obviously they fought in France on the ground as a second land army, as you say, but that wasn't their specialty. You're seeing something very recently, the same type of things happening with the Marine Corps. So let's go back to their roots, which is amphibious assault. So they turned their the best minds in the 1920s and the 30s in developing something called the 1934 Tentative Landing Operations Manual. So this was a real strategic look at making opposed landings against an opposition, against the conventional thought of the day. So in this Tentative Landing Operations Manual, 1934, they looked at landing craft, logistics, integration of naval gunfire, air support, command and control, which was a big one, like a unity of command between the naval forces and the amphibious forces. And obviously, like I said before, the naval gunfire and air support. So air support was kind of a new element in amphibious assault. So they said, well, we need to really look on that. This manual, we can say the U.S. Marine Corps actually, I think people know their history in the Pacific War, and it added quite a bit. And it's been said by a number of historians, especially Marine Corps historians, the most important strategic thing the U.S. Marine Corps gave to the world in World War II was the 1934 Tentative Landing Operations Manual, because this is what they initially used on Guadalcanal, right? It was a living document, so it kept the revisions, kept everything experienced. They put new revisions in it. The U.S. Army adopted it in 1940. I would actually say that the invasion in Normandy probably wouldn't have went down when it did if it wasn't for this manual, because that's what the U.S. Marine Corps gave for the rest of the world, this doctrine in amphibious assaults. Yeah, so that was probably the biggest thing in the littoral experience they had. It was all tentative, so to speak, and experimental. I mean, they'd done some training. I think they did 1941, they did a landing with the 1st Infantry Division. That was just elements of the 1st Marine Division, a big exercise in Maryland. I think nationally the exercise was off a place called Solomon Islands, too. That was quite funny in Maryland. And they landed at New River and a few other places to test it out. So, but they were still learning, big learning curve. As you know, the whole Guadalcanal campaign was a big learning experience, like a kindergarten for the bigger and better things to come with amphibious assaults. But they learned quite a bit about that, especially with logistics. So that
at least they started down the process of creating littoral doctrine. So
yes,
that's at least the start. So the soldiers who would be fighting, which was the 1st Marine Division, what sort of combat experience would they have had? Like, how many officers and senior NCOs would have had combat experience? And where was it that they'd been fighting? What would they have learned?
There's a thing called the Old Breed, and that's actually the 1st Marine Division's nickname's called the Old Breed. And there's been some accounts where the division was full of the old breed regulars, and they were the core of the division, and this is what made the division so great. That's true, but it's not as much as people think. About 5% of the 1st Marine Division in August of 1942 were really combat veterans, classified as combat veterans. All your senior officers were World War I vets. A lot of the senior NCOs were World War I vets. Then you had the Banana Wars. I don't know if you're familiar with the Banana Wars. Banana Wars was a series of conflicts the U.S. was engaged in, primarily U.S. Marine Corps, from the 1914, 15, 1920s, 1930s. Places, Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Nicaragua. Nicaragua was a big one. They went in Nicaragua, I think, 3 times. So there's a bit of experience in the Banana Wars. Now, this is a misinformation with the Banana War. Just because the Marines served in the Banana Wars doesn't equate to combat experience. Because the latter part of the Nicaraguan campaign, they served as advisors, and administrative type roles, not in the jungles hunting the gorillas. Some did, some didn't. So just because a Marine had on his record service in Nicaragua, when Nicaragua won campaign medal, doesn't mean they were out, chasing the bush for the Caicos. No, it's not the Caicos, the Sandinistans. I think they were called at the time. Caicos is Haiti. But you did have some that had quite a bit of experience in jungle warfare and combat. Stuff like Lewis Pullett, Chesty Pullett. You had H. Hannikin, Herman Hannikin. In fact, Herman Hannikin earned a Medal of Honor in the Banana Wars. You had Vandergrift, which is the division commander, Alexander Vandergrift. He was very well trained and had a lot of experience in Dominican Republic and Nicaragua. So you had quite a number of them. Some of the senior commanders like Colonel Whaling, Colonel Hunt, Colonel Thomas, all World War I. In fact, Whaling and Thomas were sergeants in World War I and battlefield commissions, fighting in Bellawood and Soissons and the rest of the battles there that the Marines fought toward the end of the war. So he had quite a bit of experience in that core group. I think Vandergrift actually said there was a lot that didn't know, but there was a few of us, he called professionals, that knew a bit about warfare, just enough to just stick the division together. And another thing about the old breed, some of these old breeds, as you probably know in the military, just because they were old regulars, they'd been in a little while, didn't mean they're the best in the world. In fact, some of the senior NCOs, I think the division planning officer, Merrill Twiney, said they had to be scraped out of the naval yards and bars from all over the world just to throw them in the division. And they hadn't seen the field in like 10, 15 years. I think he said they couldn't organize a Boy Scout hot dog cook-up or something like that. But you did have a core group that knew what they were doing and then could lead the rest. Now, the division, about a third were regulars, hadn't seen combat, but they were regulars. They'd been in pre-war. So they're what you consider regular. And pre-war, and even in 1942, the U.S. Marine Corps was very selective. That's why you won't see any photos of young Marines with eyeglasses. Because if you wore eyeglasses, you just couldn't come in. You'd go to the Army. But they could be highly selective because they're a small group and they appeal for a certain type of person. So pre-war, their quality was very high. And in fact, and that kept on until 1943 when the selective service, which is like the draft, came in, and then some of those went into the Marine Corps. But before that was all volunteer service, very highly selective. And Pearl Harbor, December the 7th, a lot of them signed up right after December 7th. So they went to I call them the January Pearl Harbor recruits. They went to basic training in January. In a rush to fill out the division of 19,000 men, that January boot camp went down to 5 weeks. 5 weeks of boot camp training, which is, as you know, is nothing. Before, it was something like 8 weeks to 12 weeks for normal Marine Corps boot camp training. But the quality of the men coming in, one officer said, these guys, what they made up in the lack of experience made up in quality, he said a lot of them could be officer material in the Marines. But what they're envisioned to do with the division, once they come up to speed, they were going to go to New Zealand for 6 months on an Operation Lone Wolf, they call it. And they were going to go to New Zealand, finish their training, and also garrison New Zealand at the same time. Because obviously, as you know, New Zealand and Australia was crying for garrison troops and security. So I think we'll probably cover that in one of the next questions. But that was what was envisioned. They trained up for 6 months and received more training. And they started receiving amount of equipment too, because another misconception is the Marines always got the hand-me-downs from the Army, which is generally true. I think the very well-known fact that the Marines infantry regiments landed with the 1903 Springfields and the Army had the M1 Grands. Well, the Marines actually had been issued the M1 Grands since 1941. Well, what they were doing, they were issuing them to their guard units and defense battalion units. There was a whole battalion of Marines, the 3rd Defense Battalion, that landed on August the 7th, armed with M1 Grands, M1 Grands, or hundreds of them, which is not well known. But what I'm getting at is the division, before they left the States, they had the highest priority of equipment. So apart from their 03 Springfields, they had the most modern equipment of any division. Even the 155, the Snyders, the French guns. Yeah, I mean, they were obsolete, but that was roughly what the Army had at the same time. So they had the 1919 light machine guns, the 1917 heavy machine guns, the BAR, Brown automatic rifles, the pistols, they had everything. And also they were getting the new helmets, new uniforms, all the new equipment. Once again, they were going to break this equipment in and have a bit of a shakedown when they got to New Zealand. A lot of them, they had been trained on this new equipment. They were going to do that later. So that comes into effect a bit later. And the 1st Marine Division at that stage was the strongest, most powerful division in the U.S. arsenal, apart from a tank division at the time, because it was the first amphibious trained division in U.S. history. And because it was a amphibious division, it was reinforced. All right, it had its own artillery regiment, had its own tank battalion, had an engineer battalion and a pioneer battalion, basically set up to be a landing support battalion, had its own raid battalion, its own parachute battalion, own special weapons battalion. So it was beefed up to about 20,000 men, reinforced. It's a very powerful unit, all encompassing.
That's a very large division.
Yeah, and it had all the auxiliary units, because normally with the infantry division, say the army division at the time, these would be attachments later on. They'd be attached to like chorus assets or whatever. They'd attach them to it. But this was all integral into that division. Imagine the division with its own parachute battalion, its own tank battalion, its own raider battalion, all in that division. Special weapons battalions, reinforced artillery. And yeah, it was very, very powerful, what it was designed for. And with a whole air support wing, which is equivalent of the infantry division, specifically designed for them for close CAS support, close air support. So it was a very powerful division. It wasn't as bad as it's made out to be. It's just that they were very green. But they were going to be America's fight back unit, probably in about after January 1943. That was what I was envisioned. Trained for 6 months, and they were going to lead America's assault in the Pacific to fight back.
So they didn't quite get all of that timing.
Yeah, we'll see.
What intelligence did the United States have on the Japanese operations in Guadalcanal as they were starting to do their planning for the operation?
Yeah, so that's another misinformation and a myth. I don't know if you've spoken about Ultra, the breaking of the Japanese codes. Ultra, the U.S. Ultra from based out of Hawaii, so they're breaking the Japanese codes, the naval and diplomatic codes. With Ultra, so they had Ultra. Ultra was giving them a lot of information on the Japanese. They also had radio intercepts, so they were reading the Japanese radio intercept traffic. So they were getting a lot of intel from that. To preserve the Ultra secret, I know you've spoken extensively about Operation Ferdinand, the Coast Watchers, and the Australians Coast Watchers. So the Australians had 3 Coast Watchers on Guadalcanal. You had Clemens, McFarland, and my favorite, which is Snowy Rhodes. You could do an episode just by itself on Snowy Rhodes, an old light horse digger. You know, Martin Clemens was kind of like the, I guess you could say the upper class boys school, very prim and proper and very, very efficient officer material. But then Snowy Rhodes was an old sergeant who didn't put up with nothing. Old light horse sergeant didn't put up with nothing. So anyway, but you had them there. And they were gathering intelligence. And you also, at that time, had B-17s flying out of Espiritu Santos, Infante. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing some of these. But they were flying reconnaissance flights in that area too. So that was the main ways Americans were gaining intelligence. And the 1st Marine Division, I'll probably talk about this later, but before they went into Guadalcanal, once they knew they were going into actual Guadalcanal, the Marines were in New Zealand at the time, and they sent the Division's D2, which is the intelligence officer, Getchy, Lieutenant Colonel Getchy. They sent him to Australia to interview former planters, colonial officials, and people who had lived on Guadalcanal and Tulagi and the surrounding areas to gain information as much as they could. And then some of those, I think he spoke to 37 of them. I think 8 of them went back with him, and they served as guides during the campaign. I think we'll talk later, but to throw a bit of an Australian slant to it, the first Allied soldier to hit the ground in the Guadalcanal campaign was an Australian.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, Pilot Officer Spencer. And I guess we'll talk about him a bit later. Very interesting fellow. How they gathered their intel.
How about the Japanese? What sort of intelligence were they getting about future Allied planning?
Yeah, so I'll take it a step back. Why the Japanese were actually, how they arrived on Guadalcanal. And so in early 1942, it was kind of stage 2 for the Japanese. So they'd taken everything they wanted in stage 1. And they go, well, what are we going to do for stage 2? So the Imperial Japanese Navy wanted to continue the assault and drive down, and as you probably would have spoken length about this, drive down into the Southwest Pacific and South Pacific. With their plans, they put forward a plan or bounced it around in early 42 about invading Australia. And I'm pretty sure you spoke about this in length too. And the Imperial Japanese Army didn't like that one bit. They said, well, look, it's going to take something like 12 divisions and just an unestimated amount of logistics even to have those guys there. So, because their eyes were basically on China, the Imperial Japanese Army. And they said to the Navy, they said, well, you carry on the South Pacific. And the Navy says, okay, we'll stop the stop the plan and land Australia. But what we want to do, we want to continue the drive to Fiji, Samoa, New Caledonia. And that became Operation FX, the drive down to cut off the supply line, the chain between Australia and America, and Operation FX. So what they were going to do, they formed an army called the 17th Army, Lieutenant General Hayataki, and it was going to be based in Rabaul. And they were going to be the lead element to take Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia. So a staging area, they had to have air coverage. So what they wanted to do was they looked at Guadalcanal and they said, well, we'll build an airfield there. That will be our staging base for Operation FX. We'll continue the drive down. But then you had the Battle of Midway in June. That kind of initially put the hamstring on Operation FX. They postponed it for 2 months. And then a short time later, they canceled it. They said, there's no way we can do it because obviously we got New Guinea going and we need to concentrate on New Guinea. But the airfield was built there. So they continued to build the airfield. They said, well, we can base bombers there and interdict the supply line and push out a bit if we need to, and also protect our right flank. And so they started building in the airfield in July 42. They sent 2 construction units there, naval construction units, the 13th and 11th construction units. They were basically Korean laborers, conscripted Korean laborers, weren't slaves, like some people said. Of course, they weren't treated well. They were the bottom of the pecking order, but some of them were volunteers. They were the lower class who couldn't be conscripted in the Japanese infantry. So a lot of these were Formosans and Koreans mainly in these Imperial Japanese Navy construction units. And they had a sprinkling of Japanese engineers in with them, and they had a small security force of Japanese Special Naval Land and Infantry units. So they were there building an airfield. Now, intelligence-wise, 20 miles to the north, a place called Tanimbogo in Gavutu, they had a seaplane base, Japanese seaplane base. And they'd taken it over from the Australians, the Royal Australian Air Force, which had a base there. So in May of 42, when the Japanese came in, they took that base over. So they would run reconnaissance flights out of there, mainly protecting the flank of the Japanese efforts in New Guinea. They also was tapping into the Allied radio codes, radio traffic. Same thing that the Allies were doing to the Japanese. They were doing the same, especially at Rabaul. They were Rabaul. How do you say Rabaul or Rabaul? How do you call it? What do you say?
I'm no expert on pronunciation. Rabaul, I think, though. But yeah.
Yeah, Americans call it Rabaul. Maybe I could just hybrid call it Rabaul. Anyway, Rabaul. We'll call it Rabaul. So, yeah, they had the 8th Fleet. Imperial Japanese Navy had a fleet called the 8th Fleet, and they were based out of Rabaul. So they had some intelligence guys there. At one stage, in July, they said, look, there's a lot of radio traffic coming in from around New Caledonia, New Zealand, and I think the Americans or the Allies are up to something. I think they're going to do a big assault somewhere. And then they went up to the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, and they looked at it and went, no, I don't think so. That's probably just troop reinforcements coming in. If they do anything, it might be just limited raids, because you got to remember the Americans had done some limited carrier raids and things like that. And they said, we don't expect Americans to be doing anything until at least early next year, which is 1943. But some of the Japanese intelligence was actually at the harbors and the sites where the Allies were leaving from. So they had human intelligence work in those areas. You also got to remember, too, pre-war around Tulagi and that area, the Japanese fishermen, a lot of Japanese fishermen around. And some of these later turned out to be Japanese Imperial Navy intelligence agents who actually arrived. There was a famous one who actually arrived later. And they said, we know you from pre-war. I think you were a carpenter or something. Now you're Japanese Special Naval Landing Officer, and you're back. And so that was some of the ways they gathered in intelligence, just like they did in Pearl Harbor and a few other places around the Pacific. They infiltrated their people, which who knows, it might be happening today. But anyway, so that's how the Japanese really got their intelligence.
So, why Guadalcanal then? What was it that the US Joint Chiefs of Staff decided that Guadalcanal was going to be the place where they were going to make their first offensive land-based campaign for the war?
Yeah, so just like the Japanese, I think we'll take it back to early 42. So there's a guy called Admiral King, Ernest King. He was the chief of all naval operations for the U.S. So King, at the time, the American and the British High Command had a conference called Acadia Conference. And there, as after Pearl Harbor, they were just going to say, well, how are we going to tackle this war, our priorities? So after Acadia Conference, they decided, they both agreed it's going to be a Germany first policy. So that meant what they were going to do in the Pacific, they were going to adopt a defensive posture. And the most important thing was to protect the vital American to Australian supply line or communication line. It basically ran from, whichever way you wanted to say, but say, for example, it ran from the United States, it covered went down to the South Pacific, hooked near New Zealand, and went straight to Australia. So that was vital to keep it open for a couple of big reasons. One, the Allied, Australia and New Zealand was big allies in the war, so we wanted to keep them in. And two, any fight back the Americans planned had to be staged from Australia. Whether it was in the South Pacific or Southwest Pacific, that was the staging base. So they're going to turn Australia into a giant springboard for offensive springboard, like they did England to go into Normandy. That was going to be the big springboard. So they had to keep that open. So they had to adopt a defensive posture in the Pacific. And King had come up with an idea to the Joint Chief of Staff. He said, look, I know we're adopting a defensive posture, but can we do limited offensives to keep the Japanese off balance, and also to potentially grab future springboards or small offensive boards on our own? And they agreed on it. And in principle, they go, yes, no problem, but we don't have the resources then, because all the resources they were sending to the Pacific was just to garrison all these islands and shore up that line, because that was number one priority. So Midway happened, and it basically it didn't shift the initiative, strategic shift. To me, a turning point, I don't like that term, but is one of the turning points, of course, but it wasn't the turning point, because the strategic initiative didn't completely shift. The Japanese are still on the offensive after Midway, but what it did, it paused the Japanese, and King recognized this, and he was looking for any excuse to do his operation. And he had an operation plan called Operation Pestilence. And that Operation Pestilence was the seizure of Tulagi and surrounding islands is stage one. Stage two was to move up the Solomon's chain to isolate Rabaul, taking the other islands around Rabaul. And stage three was to actually take Rabaul itself, because that was the most important base in the South Pacific, Rabaul. The Japanese recognized it in the very beginning of the war. That's when they grabbed it, as you've probably discussed it, because it protected all their central holdings. And that was Operation Pestilence. So the first stage of Operation Pestilence was Operation Watchtower. That was the seizure of Tulagi and the surrounding islands. So King pushed to George Marshall, who's basically the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, you'd say. And he said, look, we need to go on the offensive. We've probably even lost the initiative now because we're just waiting. We need to go right now because we've got a bit of a window opening. We need to strike. So that was agreed upon. I think it was July the 2nd. The Joint Chiefs of Staff sent the orders to a guy called Vice Admiral Gormley, and he was the South Pacific commander, and he was based in New Caledonia. And at that stage, the first elements of the 1st Marine Division had been arriving in New Zealand. Sorry, Gormley was in New Zealand at this stage. He moved to New Caledonia later, but he was in New Zealand. So the first elements started coming in, only like one regiment. The rest of them were still at sea coming in. And he got the message, and the invasion date from July the 2nd was 1 August. And he said, well, there's no way this can go down. So he went and visited MacArthur in Australia. And MacArthur agreed. He goes, we don't have the resources to do this. Because that stage, it was in MacArthur's realm, the Southwest Pacific. So they moved the boundary over slightly to the west. So it wasn't in MacArthur's area anymore. It became under Nimitz. So Nimitz was the South Pacific commander, and Gormley. Gormley was Nimitz was the Pacific commander. Gormley was South Pacific commander. His boss. So it was going to be the first stage, going to be a U.S. Navy Marine Corps led operation. Then stage 2 and 3 was going to fall under MacArthur and the U.S. Army, with the isolation of Rabaul and then taking Rabaul. So Vandegrift, his team started working on it. And then American radio intercepts, or Ultra, and radio intercepts combined with Ultra, worked out the Japanese were going to land a unit or 2 units on Guadalcanal to start building an airfield. So what they did was they sent a message out to the Coast Watchers to verify this, and also to send B-17 flights up. So the B-17 flights and the Coast Watchers verified that they are building an airfield here. So at that stage, Guadalcanal was thrown into the mix. So before it was Tulagi and the surrounding islands. Guadalcanal wasn't even on the initial orders. But when the airfield was being, information airfield was being built, Guadalcanal got through in. And all that started with Vandegrift and his staff, because they recognized the importance of seasoning an airfield. Because at that stage, you got to remember the importance of air domination and air control hadn't really set home to some of the higher ups, especially in the U.S. Navy Command, because Twining called them the Blue Water Navy. He said they were designing plans that didn't include any air support because they didn't even factor that in. And you'll see, as we speak about the campaign later, that Vandegrift was always getting pressure to take the island, take the island, take the land, take the land. And Vandegrift knew from minute one, it wasn't about taking the land. It was about airfields, taking and holding that airfield, because that was all that was important. The land didn't matter. It was that airfield, that unsinkable aircraft carrier. And he recognized that from the beginning. So his staff started working on the plans, and they said, look, we want to include Guadalcanal. And that was quickly approved by Gormley, Nimitz, and up to King. They said, yep, include it on there. Then it became the priority. So Tulagi was the secondary target. Guadalcanal then became the first target. All about that airfield.
Absolutely. Now, the Marines referred to Operation Watchtower as Operation Shoestring. Why was that?
Well, yeah, it goes back to what I said in the last question. So basically, one, they didn't have much resources. It was done planning-wise. They've got the operation order. So they get the operation order on 2 July with a target date of 1 August, a month, to stage the largest amphibious assault in modern history at that stage. 84 vessels, 20,000 men. Most of their ships were admin loaded. They weren't combat loaded. Vandegrift still had 2 regiments still at sea. 1 regiment was only there. Most of the stuff hadn't been unpacked. They hadn't trained. They hadn't even fired some of their weapons. I mean, for example, 1 battalion was missing their boats, missing a number of boats from their rifles. So they had to scrounge around and get those going. They had the gear, but the gear was packed, hadn't been tried, and it was just imagine that, equate it to today's. It's just crazy. So everything, they had a running joke. This is just a shoestring, like a shoestring budget. We're running on. The plans are. We don't have much planning time. We don't have much resources. In fact, when they went in, they had to cut down their weight. They had to go in lean and mean, so to speak. Each Marine could only take the uniform they're wearing, as much ammunition they could carry on the person, as much stuff they could carry in a light pack. They could carry a poncho and a shelter half. That's it. All the tentage for the whole division was left back, except for the medical tents. Half of the vehicles were left. They put a lot of ammunition, a lot of food in. In fact, more ammunition than they needed, but that was the first time they actually had a full-on invasion. They did 10 units of fire. I don't know if you know what a unit of fire is or discussed it yet, but that's how much a unit can fire in one day and sustain combat. So 10 units of fire, and once you break that down, that's like millions of rounds. In the lessons learned after the campaign, they said, well, we probably only need 4 units of fire initially to go in. Yeah, so things like that. They were a lot of heavy equipment they left back. They were 155 millimeter howitzers. They left all of those back, the whole battalion of them, and the prime movers, because there's way too much. But they did go in with 2 battalions of 75 millimeter howitzers and a battalion of 105 millimeter howitzers, and they all landed. But yeah, so it was all on a budget, Operation Shoestring. And another thing with the planning, that might be, were you going to cover that next with the planning about how it was done?
No, I was thinking we could pretty much start with the brief of Tulagi, so we can talk about that now if you want.
Well, the planning too, because normally in planning large operations, it's the plans come down from the top. Well, this one is reverse, because at that stage, William Kelly Turner, who was the admiral in charge of amphibious forces, hadn't reached New Zealand at the time. Admiral Fletcher, who was going to be in charge of the whole operation, tactical charge operation, was still en route from Hawaii under radio silence. So it was up to the Marine Division to start doing initial plans. So they started doing initial plans. And then when Turner's staff came, they said, "Oh, here's our plans, have a look." And Turner's staff said, "Yep, that's good." They changed a few things. Some things they changed that Vandegrift didn't like, because Vandegrift wanted to do a night landing. But the Navy said, "No, that's too dangerous." Vandegrift said, "We'll only do a night landing." Also, they wanted to land in an area right on Ilunga Point, which is an easier beach to land on because you don't have much enfilade. You go straight on it and straight into the airfield. But intelligence was telling them there's a reinforced Japanese regiment there. So they landed a place called Red Beach, or Beach Red, slightly to the east. But that was a concave beach, which they didn't want to land there because potentially if that was defended, you had enfilade fire on both sides. But lucky for them, they landed and there's no one there. Just to tell you how shoestring it was, the actual landing orders, the head commander of the whole thing, Gormley, didn't look at the actual landing orders until 3 weeks after the invasion. That's probably an indication of how out there it was. So that was how the planning process went. And it's like reverse planning, but from the bottom up to the top. But it was the Marines that actually said, we need to grab that airfield at Guadalcanal, which was a great move and divert most of their resources then to land on Guadalcanal with the planning.
It's a really important operational insight because there was nothing on Guadalcanal of any use apart from that airfield, really, was there?
No, there was 14. The island, like I said, same size as Delaware. It's 90 miles long. There was probably 14,000 people living there, and just a number of coconut plantations with some coconut workers, locals, and some Europeans or Australians there. So it wasn't really much. Tulagi was the seat of the British protectorate's capital. It was what you think a British colonial capital would be. It was nice manicured grounds, had a cricket oval, nice cricket oval, country club, government buildings, had a governor residence, and it was very nice little area. That was where everything was. A few stores, Chinese stores. There was nothing on Guadalcanal at all, except coconut trees and kunai grass.
We'll leave the interview there. You can see that Dave is a wealth of knowledge. He's actually got a book coming out, Guadalcanal's Longest Fight, The Pivotal Battles of the Matanacao Front. This will be an amazing book when it comes out. You can see that he has researched the campaign extensively. So there'll be a lot to learn from the book, and there'll be a lot to learn from this series. The next episode that we're going to do looks at the landings on Tulagi.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos, and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.